yourself. Tell us you look at me the entire time.
Oh, look at you the entire time?
Yes.
Okay. All right. My name is Sharron Strictland White, and that's Sharon spelled with two R's, S-H-A-R-R-O-N. I'm a native Atlantan. I claim to be. My mom migrated to Atlanta when I was an infant. And of course, I was born in 1942, July 27th, so I'll be 73 years old this month. And what I'm about to talk about happened 50 years ago. So I'm glad to be sitting in this chair and able to recollect some of the things that really invoke some powerful feelings. Because I lived on the right side of history with the kinds of things that happened during the student movement in Atlanta. As a small child, I remember segregation because my father worked for the L&N Railroad, and we had to go to the Union Station to see him off. When we got to the Union Station to see him off, they had signs. One said colored and one said white. So I ran over there and I got some water from the white water fountain. And then I ran over there and I got some water from the colored water fountain. And I said, this water is not colored, because I could read. I was expecting it to come up like punch. Segregation was something that we were protected from. Back then we were colored. I was a little colored girl in Atlanta. My uncle Willard Strickland was one of the original 8 cops that served Atlanta. They could not arrest white people. They had to hold the perpetrator and wait for a white policeman to come and arrest the perpetrator. Chief Jenkins was the police chief back then, and he did not allow the colored cops in the same precinct with the white cops, so they had to change their uniforms and use the office at the Butler Street YMCA that runs on Butler Street, that ran perpendicular to Auburn Avenue back in the day. My childhood was a happy time, however, because the culture was self-contained. That was the time when Auburn Avenue was bustling with black businesses, and we were self-sufficient and independent within our culture. So we had access to every need provided by blacks, whether it be your doctor, your dentist, your attorney, your everything that we needed was provided within the black community. Also, the church was an integral part of our culture. So we spent many a day at our churches, whether they be Baptist or Methodist or whatever. The denomination didn't matter. But that's where we took care of each other during this particular period of time. Well, I was in high school from 1955 to 1960. I graduated high school in 1960. During that time, Ivan Allen was running for mayor. So he hired us to campaign for him, and he paid us $25 a week, which was a lot of money back then, to put flyers out. And we did that. And of course, at that time, I didn't realize he was responsible for putting up the buffer zone right there at Peyton Road, and was instrumental in discouraging blacks to move past that line. And of course, that was during the time when housing was segregated too. Brown versus Board of Education. Segregation with the separate but equal doctrine didn't work because it was not really equal. I mean, it was separate, but it wasn't equal. When we were at Washington High School, we were given the secondhand books from Roosevelt High School, and it had Roosevelt High School stamped in the books. But at that time, because of the fact that there was segregation, we had some of the brightest minds teaching us at Washington High School. These were people who were trained in the discipline. the curriculum was so astute until we were taking Russian, we were taking physics, we were taking Latin. We took all of the courses that provided us with an attitude, concepts, and skills necessary to perform competently in a segregated society. I think as a result of finishing Washington High School, then I did go to Morris Brown College. And it was there that I started to work for the Atlanta Inquirer. Lottie Watkins, and I haven't heard her name mentioned much, but she was quite a businesswoman in Atlanta and worked for Herman Russell, who was building apartments where we were colored back then, where colored folks could live, because at that time there was no housing, even for young couples. You either had to room in with somebody in order to just have your basic need of housing met. Well, as a result of working for Lottie Watkins, I was her girl Friday. I used to take her money to the bank, and I would have $2,000 in my drawer. I never got robbed. The office was right there on what we call Hunter Street, but it's now Martin Luther King. And on a given day, she introduced me to Mr. Jesse Hill, who was at that time president of Atlanta Life Insurance Company. But the Atlanta Inquirer was born, and they hired me as a reporter for the Atlanta Inquirer. And at that time, Julian Bond, Charles Black worked for the paper. Irene Ireland was our secretary at that time. Mr. Billups was in charge of advertising, and advertising drove the paper. That was during the time of the old-fashioned linotype machine, so you really had to meet the deadlines, and that was the part that I didn't like, because on one given occasion, Mr. Hill came in and he said, "Miss Strickland, do you have that copy ready? Do you have it ready?" And I said, "No, sir, I'm working on it." And he just raked everything off my desk, and he said, "Look, with a newspaper, you have deadlines. If you don't meet the deadline, you're dead," and raked everything off my desk. Well, Julian Bond came in and he rescued me. And he said, "Don't worry about it." He used to call me Brenda Starr. He said, "Don't worry about it, Brenda Starr." He said, "We'll get it together." And we covered the news of what was going on, what with the movement. And on one occasion, we went downtown to cover the police blotter. And so Bond said, "Well, Sharon, let's take the back stairs because we might encounter a police brutality case." And on that day, we didn't, but we covered the police blotter, and we covered the activities that were going on with the movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was a collective effort of the entire Atlanta University Center. So that included Morehouse, where Julian Bond was, and Charles Black. Then, of course, you had, besides Morehouse, you did have Spelman with Ruby Doris Smith. And then you had Clark with Carolyn Long Banks and Ben Brown. And then I was at Morris Brown with William Hickson. They would leave and come around the campus all the way to West Hunter Baptist Church. That's the little rock church that's right there on Martin Luther King now, but of course then it was Hunter Street. And it was there in the meetings. And Julian Bond conducted those meetings, helped to conduct those meetings, and we were told over and over to exercise passive resistance. Passive resistance. That was the buzz. Passive resistance. And we had two groups. We had the arrest group, and we had the hit and run group. Now, I was in the hit and run group. And I'll explain to you why I was in the hit and run group. At that time, Frank Cunningham was the president of Morris Brown College, and then we had Dr. Manley, I think it was the president over Spelman. But even the classes and the ongoing academic world, academia was sensitive to what was going on, but they still didn't make any provisions for it. which meant that if you were out of class during the time there was a final exam, it would affect your grade. When I was at Morris Brown, I was on full scholarship as long as I maintained a B average, and I never missed the dean's list. I made the dean's list every time. Then I could maintain my scholarship. And there was no money for college. And so I knew how important it was for me to maintain that scholarship. So that's why I was in the hit and run group. All right. On a given day, and it was cold that day that we decided to go and picket. We picketed Davison's, which is now Macy's now, on Peachtree Street. And across the street was Woolworth's. When I was picketing, a woman honked and expectorated on me. So I had to just keep walking with my sign. We would walk around and around. And then the woman in front of me, well, actually we were students then, somebody just ripped up her sign. But in the meetings, they said, passive resistance. So we were not to react. We were to be non-violent. So we continued to picket. And then, of course, they called the police. And when they called the police, then that's when the arrest group got arrested. And that's when those of us who were in the hit and run group were not arrested. At that time, Louise Hollowell was teaching at Morris Brown College. She was my major professor, and she was the wife of Donald Hollowell, who was the attorney that bailed everybody out. I'm so glad that the ones who were in the arrest group made the sacrifice. I remember Carolyn Long Banks and Julian Bond, because they made the ultimate sacrifice because it affected their whole academic prowess. They were not able to be in class for the final exams. And so, therefore, their schooling was interrupted. They made that sacrifice. I think that the buzz back then came with the backdrop of the Berlin crisis that was going on. Ralph McGill was the editor-in-chief of the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, and back then we had two newspapers, the morning paper and the evening paper. But the Atlanta Inquirer really was the one that decided to really recognize the pulse of the public and really tell actively what was going on with the movement. I think as a result of the efforts of SNCC, that it was like a gigantic nucleus that permeated the community. And it was decided that we would imitate what was going on in Alabama in terms of the buses. We didn't have any problem with desegregating the buses because we all lived in a segregated society of Atlanta, and the 3 West Hunter bus had nobody on there but black people, so you could just sit anywhere on the bus. But at that time, we decided not to ride the buses, period, and they provided what we call jitneys. And even the people who worked as maids didn't even ride the buses. Some of the cabs and some of the people who owned automobiles would pick up the maids and take them to Buckhead to work in those domestic kinds of positions. When I think back on it now, I'm just glad that I had an opportunity to participate in the movement, and that's what it was. It was definitely a movement, and we can tell that there has been a change. And what's remarkable to me, though, is for us to come up as students with that Bill for Human Rights, because all of the issues that we put forth back then as students are the same issues that we have now for jobs and for education and for the right to vote. They had the Junior Voters League involving the high school students who went out to help in terms of encouraging people to get out to vote. Hosea Williams' name is not mentioned very much, but he is a Morris Brown person and was truly an academic person too, because he was an expert when it came to chemistry. But he's been described too as a rabble-rouser because he would really meet head-on people who were trying to enforce segregation. So that's about the story as I remember it. I can see the growth. I lived in the Cascade area after becoming an adult. And of course, I witnessed the white flight. I lived on Anna Lane, right off of Benjamin E. Mays Drive, which was Sewell Road at that time when we moved there, and they renamed it for Benjamin E. Mays, who lived on Pamlico in the neighborhood. But I do remember how the street was white in terms of residences, and then the ball players who all of a sudden had money, and money is green, and Brown and Reese, the realtors, decided to sell those houses, and so whites moved out and blacks moved in. Only a smidgen of the whites remained. So at that time we had Frank Pitts that played with the Kansas City Chiefs. He went to the Super Bowl twice. They lived across the street. And then Hank Aaron lived on Linfield before he moved to Adams Drive, where he lives now, when he lived with his first wife on Linfield. Well, all of the ball players were making lots of money, and so they bought those houses. I think we moved in there back in 1968 when the mortgages were like $35,000. And I remember Diane Pitts said, "Sharon, we're going to pay off our mortgage." And I thought, pay off the mortgage? We're in this for 30 years. But anyway, the diversity is a good thing, because now, even at 72 years old, I live in Cobb County. And true, I do see a few of the Confederate flags sporadically around, but the community where I live now at the Highlands of West Village, there's such diversity, and the living is easy. It may be because I'm old, though. I miss Sharron in my community. They help me get the groceries out of the car, and I'm talking about whites and blacks and Hispanics, a lot of Hispanic workers, the Indian women with their little dots on the forehead. I mean, it's just a diversified culture, and I'm so glad I lived to see it. I'm so glad, thank you, Lord, that I lived to see it. And right now I'm in bereavement because my friend, Sharon Watson Devonish, expired on the 4th of July. And this time, and she was a Clark College student. And of course, we remained friends all these years. I went to Frank L. Stanton Elementary School with her. Prior to that, she went to Oglethorpe Elementary School. In Atlanta, Oglethorpe Elementary School was the private school back in the day for affluent blacks. And she and I shared so much history. But there's hope. There's hope. When Dr. King said, "I may not get there with you," we're on our way. I can't say we have arrived, but we are on our way. And I'm just so glad to have been born black and female. Well, correction, I was born colored, because we were colored back then. Born colored and female in the United States of America. because my sorority now, Delta Sigma Theta, is heavily involved in trying to do some empowerment of women because of the atrocities that are happening to females all over the world. I know I'm kind of garrulous, but the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was an engine, and it was the little engine that could, and it did. And President Barack Obama campaigned on, yes, we can. So we can say, yes, we did. And we're going to keep on doing. So, I don't know. I used to grade papers and I would mark my students down if they were desultory and unorganized. And I realize now I have just been all around Robin Hood's barn. So if you want to bring me back to a point.
No, you are doing excellent. You've hit so many of the points that are already here. So you did mention the Appeal for Human Rights. Can you talk a little bit more about your involvement with that?
Well, basically there was a brainstorming in terms of the needs of the community. And at that time, the idea for education was to gear students up so that they could either choose of what we called a vocation or choose to go into college to choose a profession. And but the problem was there were no jobs. There were no jobs. In fact, when I look back on it, the teachers that we had were some of the brightest minds on the planet, African Americans. We were colored back then. The colored teachers were wonderful. But there were no jobs for them. You either had to work at the post office or at one of the car companies or teach school or wait tables. But there were no jobs. There were no jobs. So the job issue was paramount. And Ruby Doris Smith, I think, contributed a lot to the writing in terms of the appeal for human rights. Charlene Hunter Galt lived on Mosley Place, right near Mathewson Place, where I lived, too. And, of course, she showed those signs of journalism even back in the day, too, and went to Frank L. Stanton Elementary School, where I went. But the writing of that document reflected the times with the jobs, the education, and voters' rights. Those were the three main issues. And of course, with education, the idea then was to really prepare students to come out and become gainfully employed. And back in the day, too, we had that discrimination among ourselves, too. My mom, of course, we all have the same history, but my great-grandmother was mulatto. So my mom was fair-skinned, my sister is fair-skinned. I'm about the darkest one. And at Morris Brown College, too, even if you became a queen, I was Miss Morris Brown 1963-64, and I was the darkest one that rode on the float, because we used to discriminate against each other. It was like the fairer your skin, the more you were accepted. And even my cousin got a job. Her name was Clara Jeanette Lamar. they hired her to work in Walgreens just because of her fair skin. And my sister got a job at the Kaplan's 5 and 10 cent store there on Edgewood that runs parallel to Auburn Avenue, and she got the job because of her fair skin, my sister. They hired her. That year I couldn't find a job anywhere. Thank God for Lottie Watkins and the Atlanta Inquirer, because at least I got a job, and back then I made $25 a week. But you either had to work as a domestic, there were no jobs. They were not to be had. You know, they weren't available. And the ones that were available, they discriminated against. They hired some guys and some girls at the banks. But that's because they had the fair skin and they would blend in. And even my friend who's gone on now, Sharron Watson Devon, she was a pioneer and flew as a flight attendant for TWA. And they hired her because she was fair skinned. My high school class of Washington High School, 1960, is made up of pioneers all around, because Ronald Yancey finished Georgia Tech in 1964. He had to have an armed guard to go with him across to pick up his degree. But look at God, look at God. My own son was able to finish Georgia Tech, and Robert White III, and John Lewis was the speaker on the day of his commencement in the stadium over there at Georgia Tech. So look at how we're moving forward. I say the word is excelsior. Onward and upward. That's where we are now. Onward and upward. Onward and upward. In terms of education, there were two schools of thought. Some people thought that you should be really prepared academically, and some other people thought that you needed to have a bread and butter skill. You needed to have something you could do, because folks didn't care how much you knew and what you know. They want to know what you can do. And so Carver High School was very good in training students when it came to cosmetology, auto mechanics. And I understand even now they have EMS over there where they teach you how to become the person to respond in case of an emergency. But the whole idea was, well, you know, there's just as much dignity in tilling the soil as there is in writing a poem. We all know that. And we know a man who ignores his history is doomed to repeat it. All of the sages of our day have taught us all of that. But in my mind's eye, I think that we need to do all of the above. We need to make sure that in education that people tap into their own gift. And that's another thing. I had a chance to work with the Challenge Program for Gifted Students for 10 years. I served 5 high schools, Therrell, Mays, Turner, Harp, and Brown high schools, during the magnet school concept in education, and that was to group like minds who were on the same path. And so at Therrell High School, they had the law and government magnet, and the students were concentrating on what it took to get into forensic issues, and also the debating with the debate team and with the quiz bowl team and those kinds of things. And they even have a simulated courtroom over there at Therrell High School now, and if you walk in there, you're thinking the real thing, because that's how important it was to get these students who were leaning toward that path to do that. Then when you leave Therrell High School, I would go to Benjamin E. Mays High School, and there we had math rhythms. At Thurl High School, we had Dr. Moss, Larry Moss. And at Mays High School, we had Helen Carithers, and she was single and married to the job because she really did a great job, and those students would get that way. And then, of course, we would leave there and go to Harper High School, Charles L. Harper High School, and that was the money and banking magnet. So all the students who are interested in going into money and banking, you would get them together. And students had to qualify for all of those programs. And then, of course, at Brown, we were dealing with communications. So it's the whole concept was to get students, according to their own gifts and talents, to reach their full potential. And I do know that everybody has a gift. Everybody has a gift. It's a matter of being introspective and finding out what your gift is so that you can promote that gift to have an impact on the larger society. And that way you become a self-actualized adult. But that was a school of thought with education for a period of time there. But I'm really worried now because what with computers now, we don't have the same ideas. Winston Churchill, and I used to teach my students that one of the characteristics of an intelligent man is to be able to read, write, and speak your mother tongue at least with competency and efficiency so as not only to understand but to be understood beyond a doubt. But now we flip on the TV, and I'm not going to call his name, but he's doing really, really well, but his command of the English language is not that good. And I said, standard English is your money language. You got to learn how to speak standard English. And so some of our standards are just different. And then in elementary school now, I did work next to two principals in elementary school, and they've taken out cursive writing. I mean, how are you going to sign your checks? And then all of this talk about new math. It's like last I heard, if you start counting from 1 to go forward to infinity, that would be the same numbers. If you go backwards with minus 1 to infinity, are they not the same numbers? So what's new about math? I mean, what's new about it? Why are you going to confuse the students and come up with all this new math? Math isn't new. If you don't know your tables, you can't multiply, you can't divide. I mean, there's some things that are tried and true, and we just need to stick with it with education and give people the foundation. Now you walk into a bank and you can't even get your money if the system is down. We're relying too heavily on the computers. And my kids wanted to know, who is Mr. Google anyway? And we're taking Mr. Google for granted. Anything you want to know now, you just type it in on the computer and then and Google it, and then Mr. Google will tell you the facts. You have no way of determining where the facts came from or whose perspective it is. But see, back in the day when we did term papers and you had to write out everything and use APA, you had to have footnotes and you had to have a bibliography of the references of where you got that information from. So now, I'm glad I lived to see it though, but now when I type in something, the computer will anticipate what I want before I even hit enter. I said, how did the computer? So I don't like the idea of machines beginning to think for us, because I think that you should be able to analyze, criticize, synthesize information, and be able to think on your own. And the moral dilemmas that we're in now, and that's a whole nother thing. But back in the day, during segregation, there was not a plethora of all the religions, and therefore it was Christian-based. Now, it's amazing to me, though, how the United States Constitution is Christian-based. But back then, in the morning, we would have what you call devotions, and everybody would stand up and pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation. And back then, we didn't even have under God in it. We put it in there, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We stood up every day to say that. So it was like patriotism. And then we would go through some scriptures in the Bible. I mean, there were some things you were supposed to know if you were educated because it came from scriptures in the Bible. If you were intelligent, you knew that. And so, but it gave a premise, it gave a foundation, it gave you something to draw on. And those people who didn't go to church and who were unchurched, they still got at least a devotion to start the day, so you would wake up and feel a spirit of joy and a motivation for the task at hand for the day. But now, and I saw it happen even during my time in education, they took that out. Not only did they take it out, but you can get fired. I mean, Mary Emanuel over there at Thurl High School was having a prayer during homeroom, and one of the parents reported her, and she was called to task by the Board of Education and told her in no uncertain terms that was not to go on in her homeroom and that she would be fired. So there are a lot of issues, a lot of issues, but I think that you should never, ever underestimate the executive power of the human mind. And we need to really study it and try to make sure that we do have liberty and justice for all. You know, Black lives matter, but all lives matter. And so as an old lady now, and I'm glad to be an old lady, because my friends are expiring all around me. Started with Dorothy Borum, who was a Spelman girl, and then Portia Scott, that worked with the Atlanta Daily World. She and I were very close and used to go to Silver Sneakers together. She's checked out. And then Sandra Clements, who was a Spelman girl. And she had an international ministry going. She checked out, and as I said before, my friend Sharon Watson Devonish, who was Clark, has checked out. But we remained friends all these years because we were the Atlanta University Center. And I took classes at Clark from Dr. Pearlie Dove, Methods and Materials for Teaching. And I understand she's published a book that I'm trying to get a copy of. But there was no me and my. We were all soldiers. We had a play going on with Dr. J.P. Cochran called Fenian's Rainbow. And you could set your watch with the time that Julian Bond used to come and pick up Alice from play rehearsal, because we were in Fenian's Rainbow. So students from Morris Brown participated with the students with the Atlanta Morehouse Spelman players too, you know. It was a collective effort. We all used the Trevor Arnett Library. So the idea of this separatism within the HBCU community grieves my spirit too. I mean, we need to be on one accord. The whole idea is to have a multifaceted kind of experience, especially during your college years, so that you can meet this mean old world head on. Well, those are the ideas about education, and I just think that with the appeal for human rights, that appeal for the best education possible was visionary. And then there was an attitude sometimes in the black community whereby that if you really had a need, that the doctors from Mahara were not as good as the other doctors, and that honey, if you have an issue, and people didn't talk about cancer openly like they do now. And then even now they call it the big C. Nobody's scared to talk. But if you really had a need, you better get yourself a white doctor. Or if you have a legal need, you better get yourself a white Jewish lawyer. and that kind of attitude pervaded the black culture in a way. But there again, that's why I said that we need to make sure that students are able to think for themselves and able, like I said, to become problem solvers and problem formulators, so that that kind of warped misconception won't live. So, and in terms of the voters' rights, even now that I'm in my 70s, when I saw how they came up with all this ID you have to have, some senior citizens don't have that ID. And it's amazing how you can still vote in absentia and send your ballot in, and you won't have to have all that ID. But it's by design. It's by design. Whatever can happen to keep African Americans from being able to have that voice in voting. It's like once you find out how to play the game, and you got them all, the rules down pat, you know, you can play the game. We know how to do this. Well, you're doing too well here. Well, wait a minute. They're getting ahead. So then they change the rules. So that's the way it seems to me, and that's my perspective. But all I got to say now is, in summary, with that appeal for human rights, that's what it was. It was an appeal for human rights for the common good of all humanity. And the world is still a wonderful place. With those gifted students I was telling you about, some of them were really visionary. I remember one of my students came in and he said, "Miss White, I got the idea for, well, we don't have to worry about Georgia Power anymore." He said, "What we can use is bioluminescence." I said, "Use what?" He said, what we need to do is to study the lightning bug, and we can come up. It's like, but I learned to embrace everything that the students had to say. I think that was Brian Nesbitt that came up with that. Then I had Martin that came in, and he said, "I got an idea." I said, "What's that?" He said, "I tell you what, to connect all these continents." He said, "Right now we have the submarine." He said, "What we need is nuclear power to power the submarines. You get in, use the nuclear power to shoot the submarine from one continent to the other." Another one came up. These were all these far-fetched, crazy ideas that will manifest maybe. You never know. You never know. But they were the students who were your high-level communicators and your high-level problem solvers and your high-level problem formulators too. Because, see, sometimes there are people who are not the solvers, but they can put the problem together so you can examine it, you know. So that made it all good.
Do you remember anything about the Heart of Atlanta Hotel?
No.
No. Okay. What about the protest at Hurt Park?
No more than the fact that we had hecklers coming out of the woodwork. And thinking back, too, we need to remember that not just blacks were involved in this movement. We had some whites that were helping us, too. But even among ourselves, we took an attitude one while where this is our fight, we don't really need you. I mean, you know, just, we don't need you. But downtown Atlanta, and it's amazing to me now, even as we speak, how you can get on Peachtree and go from one end to the other and see what happens downtown Atlanta now with more and more blacks who are but I think that's an appropriate euphemism, Hurt Plaza and Hurt Park, in terms of what went on. I don't remember any more details other than the heckling and the water hoses and the dogs and just whatever they could do to humiliate you. They used, but we were undaunted. We were undaunted.
What about Grady Memorial Hospital with the desegregation?
I was born in Spalding County, Griffin, Georgia, in a clinic, Copeland's Clinic, but my mom migrated to Atlanta when I was an infant. I do know, and my brother was born at Fort McPherson because my dad was military, you know. But Grady Memorial Hospital had the segregated side, and it was called Hugh Spalding. And of course, you could go there to be born. I like what Marvin Arrington always says. He said, "I'm a Grady baby." But the services there were definitely segregated. They had what they call wards, and you were hoarded in, bed here, bed there, bed there. When we went to visit people who were in the hospital. So Grady has a history of segregation. It felt mighty good to me when Hamilton Holmes was, and he had to be God's man to make some changes when it came to Grady Memorial Hospital. And even now, I had the opportunity to visit somebody who was in the hospital there, and it was refreshing to see what is going on there. Because before you knew that those doctors had supposedly taken the Hippocratic oath, but I kind of think some of them took the hypocritic oath. But that was the issue. We had separate facility, and it was the Hugh Spalding part, that served blacks.
Anything you can tell us about the Freedom Riders?
Only that a guy who was at Frank L. Stanton with me, whose name is Larry Hunter, was one of them. He was in school at Tennessee State. Some people work behind the scenes. Sidney Boney and all of them work behind the scenes with the Freedom Riders. But Larry Hunter, Nelson, let's see who else was among the Freedom Riders that came through. They really needed to spotlight the ones in Atlanta because with Dr. King and everything here, it seems to me that we're the home plate, and somehow the Freedom Riders were kind of left out, the ones who were there. Ernestine Ward participated with the Freedom Riders, and in fact, I think she was involved with the Pettus Bridge situation when it came to the voting situation too, and traveled out of state for that. They had some unmitigated gall, is all I can say. And I thank God for them. Frank Holloway was one of them. And they were on a mission. And God didn't give them a spirit of fear. So I think they made quite a difference. Made quite a difference.
Okay. What about the quadrangle at Clark Atlanta?
Carolyn Long Banks was involved with the quadrangle at Clark Atlanta. I was on the Morris Brown end, and we had the Sarah Allen quadrangle. And it was a dorm set up like an apartment, so 5 students, 5 girls could share. And there again, the times have changed, because back then we had separate quarters, separate dorms. We even had what we call house mothers. And back then, you had to be in the dorm by 6 o'clock, and it was still light outside. And you couldn't walk to town, even though you could walk there in 10 minutes, without a note from your mom saying that you could go. And the boys were not allowed past the receiving room in the dorm. And so times have really, there's Ernestine now. I just called your name.
There. Don't you look pretty?
You're the one. I didn't know it was going to be video. I thought it was all audio.
Oh, no. It's Hi.
They just finished asking me about the Freedom Riders,
Okay.
so you can go into that.
You're going to interview me again?
Oh, you've already been
Yeah,
interviewed?
I've been done.
Oh, okay.
I've been done.
And
Take care, Mary. Good to see you.
so you're headed over to Allen Temple?
Yeah, I got to go pick Lily up first.
Okay.
And then come back.
Well, I had the privilege of Miss Atkinson came to pick me up. My husband, Larry Hunter, was one of the Freedom Riders. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, put me back off on the tangent. Put me back on the...
No, you've covered everything. I just wanted to throw those last topics out because you hadn't mentioned anything about them, but no, you've done exceptionally well, so you have a lot of information that we can definitely use.
Well, God is good. I'm glad I have lived to see the diversity come. And my thing is, and even when I was teaching school, there were some people who swore that Egypt was in the Middle East. I said, well, let's pull out the map here, and I said, let's take a look at this African continent here. I said, last we looked, Egypt is right there. That's Africa. That's north. That's Africa. It's not in the Middle East. And see, when I was teaching, too, I was itinerant, and they used to throw us anywhere. And my office one time was literally an old bathroom. The stalls were still there. But since I was itinerant, we had the program for exceptional children operated by Georgia. So you had the behavior children, disordered children, you had the gifted children, that was my group. You had the educationally mentally retarded, they didn't call it, they came up with another name, and they had the speech impaired, they had all of the people with their exceptionalities, program for exceptionalities. Well, within that group, we had a white teacher who was working with the children who were hearing impaired. Then we had a white teacher who was working with the speech impaired. Then we had, well, anyway, we were a diverse group of culture, and we had a discussion one day. And so when we got on race relations, we were talking about it. And I said, well, let's see if we can get to something that we really, really agree on. And that's when we got into this discussion. Well, they wanted to say that Egypt was in the Middle East. It's like, no, it's in Africa. So we all agree. Here's what we agreed on. Civilization started around the Mediterranean Sea. The first man was found in Africa. Does that not make us all Africans? And we jumped off from that premise. And I do have to say this, and I'm glad we do live in a world where there can be a tolerance, and I do think that education provides that tolerance. I just happen to be Christian, but the whole idea is, am I Christian just because I was born in a country and born in a family of Christians? Suppose I had been born in Morocco, I'd probably be Islamic. So that means we're going to have to really respect all of the religions. But I had an opportunity to travel to Israel. Bunny Jackson, Maynard Jackson's first wife, is a member of Cascade United Methodist Church, and she provided a trip with Rhodes Scholar. And it was a trip called In the Footsteps of Christ. So we left Atlanta, flew to New York, from New York into Tel Aviv, and I got a chance to see Old Jerusalem, New Jerusalem. I got a chance to put my hand right where Jesus put his hands on Via Dolorosa on the way to the cross. Doesn't get any better than that. I got a chance, since I'm a dancer, got a chance to dance on the Sea of Galilee. It was not a sea, it was just a lake. And our tour guide had a great sense of humor because he threw out the net, and then he said, anybody who wants to walk on the water, feel free to do so. But then he drove the little boat around to the other side, and then I got a chance to go to the Jordan River, where your namesake, John the Baptist, baptized even Jesus himself in that Jordan River. Now, I didn't pay the $50 for the white robe and all that they charged, but I put my feet in there because I had already been baptized. It didn't take one time. But everybody on the bus, practically except a few of us, got baptized in the Jordan River. Then after that, we went to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. And the little opening is about maybe 3 feet tall. Well, since, I'm only 4'11" and a half. I used to be 5 feet all my life, but that's what happens when you get to be 70. But I guess they wanted to make sure every knee was going to bow. But when we went in there, I said, well, where's the manger? Where's this Sharron? 2,000 years ago, we're not going to see no manger. No, there's no manger. I said, well, but they had a bronze star right where Jesus was born. Got a chance to see that. Then we got a chance to see the temple where the 4 friends were coming in there and they couldn't get to Jesus for the healing, and they lowered him down through the roof. We got a chance. We got a chance to see Peter's house. We got a chance to see the press that they used to make the wine, and also to get the oil out of the olives, and it was just an experience. After that, we went to the Wailing Wall and we put our prayers in the Wailing Wall. We left there and we went into Mount Sinai, and I got a chance to see where Moses brought down the tablet, and there was 750 steps, from there all the way up to the summit, and you had to be up at 2 a.m. in order to go up. But I didn't go up. I stayed behind with Mary Neal. But the ones who did go up that mountain, when they came back, they said it was a spiritual experience they'll never forget, with the sun coming up over that mountain in Mount Sinai. And we lived in the resort that used to be a personal resort of Anwar Sadat, which was pretty remote. And we didn't have radio or TV or any in those rooms. But we left there, and we did go into Egypt, and I got a chance to ride the camel. But you talking about praying, they made the camel get down on his knees and let me climb up there. I said, now, Lord, this is kind of high up for me. I don't want to fall off here. But they guided the camels, and I was able to take that. But it's an experience you won't ever forget, because at least historically you can just see the whole Bible come alive, So, and then it makes you a real educated person when you study that Bible, when you find out, as a Christian, we believe in God the Father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we talk about Abraham's son, Isaac. But we all know that Abraham had Ishmael too. And all of the descendants of Ishmael are Islamic. Well, look at God. Even though Sarah, she laughed when she said that she was going to have Isaac in her old age. She thought that was really funny. But would history be different if Abraham had raised Ishmael and Isaac alongside each other? But no, sent her out in the desert with one day's rations. Had to be God. She was protected. And so Christians are involved with the Father of many nations, but the Islamic people are involved with the Father of many nations. It doesn't matter. When I was at Thurl High School, too, it was my job to plan seminars, set up field trips, mentorships. And I invited a gentleman from the Speakers Bureau at Georgia State to come in, and he was teaching my children that the black brain was smaller than the white brain. It's like, oh no, I had to get him out of there quick. But he actually believed that. That's why I said you can't believe Mr. Google. Where did he get his information from? But and I'm so glad. I happen to be AME too, by the way. I'm a member of St. Mark AME. And that service where President Obama sang really, really gladdened my heart. And it was good to see all of those bishops, because that's a whole nother story. Richard Allen founded the AME Church. And I understand he had a pistol here and his Bible there on his desk. And I understand white folks didn't mess with him either. And many of the schools and the students don't even know that. A name for bishops of the AME Church. Henry McNeil Turner was an AME bishop. Charles L. Harper was an AME bishop. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on of the impact of the AME Church. Now, let's get back to the AU Center and look at the history. And Spelman is wonderful, like I said. I'm still close to my Spelman sisters, especially the Soras and the ones that are not Soras. But Rockefeller was the richest man in the world, not just in the United States. And he said, these offspring, you can't go to school over here with my children. but we'll make a school for you. So he named that school Laura Spelman after his wife. Rockefeller, the richest man in the world, the endowment is still good now at Spelman. So now they're not having any money problems like Morris Brown. But look at God. Morris Brown was founded in the basement of Big Bethel AME Church on soap wrappers and 10 cents you could get together and collection and all. And it was located on the other side of town before it came to the site where it is now. But look at God. It's been sustained all through the bankruptcy. And it never closed. Had to be God. Had to be. Because
Well, I like